The law school, has served in the U.S. Marine Corps and remains in the Marine Reserves as a judge advocate. I'm particularly grateful to him as a native of Massachusetts and having spent most of my life there in that peculiar political climate for the work he's done since 2012 with the Mass Family Institute, which is what it sounds like, an institution devoted to strengthening and protecting the family in Massachusetts, in which capacity Andrew has shown his remarkable capacity for grace under fire, being very frequently forced to take politically incorrect stands. And I welcome him here tonight to talk about his work and educate us about the work which we all need to do. Andrew.
Thanks, Bill. Well, thank you for having me here tonight in this glorious building. So the work I do with Mass Family Institute is to promote sort of traditional family values in public policy. And when I talk about family values, I mean primarily the sanctity of life from conception to natural death, the dignity of natural marriage, and really all of God's design for human sexuality, and increasingly our struggle for preserving our religious freedom and First Amendment rights to free speech. And so what that means is that I end up violating the guidance my parents gave me when I was young, which is that there's three things you don't talk about in public: sex, religion, and politics. And so my job is essentially to talk about all three at once. Gets me into trouble sometimes. The last talk I gave was on Thursday at Harvard Law School. I was invited by the Students for Life there to talk about the Roe Act, or the Infanticide Act, which is an aggressive pro-abortion bill that's in the Massachusetts legislature. And we were given a heads up that there would be some students protesting. They would just kind of stand up and walk out when I started talking. So we knew that was coming. And indeed, when I got there, I did see one student dressed up as a handmaid from that show. I was like, yes, I finally get protested by a handmaid. But then I just realized it was Halloween, so everybody was dressed up. So about half the students got up and left, and then the rest stayed. And then there were two guys who spent the entire 40-minute talk just making out, and they were sitting like right there in my line of sight. So I guess that was kind of an intersectional protest. I trust I don't have to worry about that tonight. So, but as I prepared my notes for this evening, talking about the of the kingdom and the future of what's been termed the culture wars, coming back to the remarkable speech a few weeks ago from our current Attorney General, William Barr, at Notre Dame Law School. Not Notre Dame for Attorney General. Anybody get to see that or read it? And I thought about just sort of, standing here and reading it verbatim. It was that good. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do so. But I do want to quote from it a bit here as I start out. Again, this is the Attorney General at Notre Dame just a few weeks ago. He says this: "On the one hand, we have seen the steady erosion of our traditional Judeo-Christian moral system and a comprehensive effort to drive it from the public square. On the other hand, we see the growing ascendancy of secularism and the doctrine of moral relativism. Now, by any honest assessment, the consequences of this moral upheaval have been grim. Virtually every measure of social pathology continues to gain ground. Along with the wreckage of the family, we are seeing record levels of depression and mental illness, dispirited young people, soaring suicide rates, increasing numbers of angry and alienated young males, an increase in senseless violence, and a deadly drug epidemic. I will not dwell on all the bitter results of the new secular age. Suffice to say that the campaign to destroy the traditional moral order has brought with it immense suffering, wreckage, and misery, and yet the forces of secularism, ignoring these tragic results, press on with even greater militancy. And among these militant secularists are many so-called progressives, but where is the progress? Now, there have been times and places where the traditional moral order has been shaken. In the past, societies, like the human body, seem to have a self-healing mechanism, a self-correcting mechanism that gets things back on course if things go too far. The consequences of moral chaos become too pressing. The opinion of decent people rebels. They coalesce and rally against obvious excess. Periods of moral entrenchment follow periods of excess. This is the idea of the pendulum. We have all thought that after a while the pendulum will swing back. But today we face something different that may mean we cannot count on the pendulum swinging back. First is the force, fervor, and comprehensiveness of the assault on religion we are experiencing today. This is not decay, it is organized destruction. Secularists and other allies among the progressives have marshaled all the force of mass communications, popular culture, the entertainment industry, and academia in an unremitting assault on religion and traditional values. So again, that's just a sort of lengthy excerpt from that talk, which I encourage you all to read or listen to. Particularly that line where he says, this is not decay, it is organized destruction. That's something we have to recognize. So I want to sort of start with maybe a few anecdotes from what many consider to be the front lines of the culture wars in my home state of Massachusetts. The culture war is something we cannot hide from. This intentional, organized destruction is going to reach out and touch all of us. Even homeschoolers, okay? My wife and I homeschool our 4 kids. Sometimes you think you can really shelter yourselves from a lot there. But I got a call back in the spring from a Catholic homeschooling family that their teenage daughter, I think she was 14, maybe 15, had a history of mental health challenges, but had recently determined that she was in fact a boy and told this to her therapist. The therapist immediately said, yes, you're right, you're a boy. This is why you're having all these other problems, because you're actually a boy and you should stop suppressing that. You need to identify as male. Started using male pronouns, told the parents to use male name, male pronouns, and let's get ready for puberty blockers and ultimately testosterone injections. And the parents said, okay, wait, we're not doing this. Okay, we're not calling her by her male name, we're not using male pronouns, and we're sure as heck not going to inject her with testosterone and puberty blockers. Now, in part as a result, the parents were faced with an inquiry from the Department of Children and Families as to whether their home would be safe for their transgender daughter. And part of that investigation involved a state investigator calling the family priest and asking him what the church's understanding of transgenderism was. All in an effort to determine whether or not this home was safe for this young girl. Now, the good news is I was able to put them in touch with an experienced family law attorney, and they were able to stave off this DCF investigation. But that type of thing happened to a Catholic homeschool. All right, so this is not just people that their kids are in the public schools or don't go to church on a regular basis. I mean, this is going to reach out and touch all of us. And as we were investigating sort of the circumstances surrounding that case, we learned that in Massachusetts, the Department of Children and Families has an LGBTQ liaison office with several staff members whose job, I guess, is to ensure that transgender boys, like this young girl, have safe homes, whatever that means. And just by example of sort of who is making these decisions, who's influencing public policy, the head of that LGBTQ liaison task force in her spare time writes novels you can buy on Amazon that can only be described as polyamorous vampire porn. So, her idea of the ideal family, according to this novel she wrote, is 2 adult homosexual men and a young girl in some kind of throuple. It's this to save the world with vampires and stuff. But I mean, that's what she's putting out there, and yet she has influence over whether Christians can adopt or foster children, and whether we can even keep our own. Scary stuff. Now, I think the transgender issue in particular often feels like the fable of the emperor's new clothes, right? Everyone is intimidated and going along with this obvious, ridiculous lie, and we're just waiting for that honest young boy to cry out in the crowd, but he hasn't got anything on. And then it'll all come crashing down. But unfortunately, it's become clear now that it's going to take more than just one boy crying out to break the spell. For example, I had a dad call me a couple years ago I know him from outside the office, and he's got a beautiful family, and he said his daughter, who was a sophomore at the time, made the varsity rowing team. So she was going to row at the head of the Charles Regatta on a varsity team as a sophomore, very excited. But then one of her classmates, who was male, identified as female, tried out for the team, and with superior bone structure and muscle mass that boys typically have over females, got the varsity spot. And so she wasn't going to row. And he said, look, what can we do about this? And unfortunately, in Massachusetts, the law is such that because we have a gender identity non-discrimination law, which we now have in New Hampshire as well, there's really nothing we could do about it legally at that point. So I said to Dad, look, here's what we do. Your daughter she's going to be very photogenic, she's well-spoken, let's have her tell her story. I've got some media allies, we can get this story out. People need to know this is what's happening with this gender identity law that just got passed. The girls are losing spots on varsity teams. And he said, well, no, wait. We can't do that. I mean, she'll be totally ostracized at school. They may even kick her out. And I said, well, okay. I mean, you're right. It's a lot to put on the shoulders of a 15-year-old kid. But you're her dad. You tell her story, all right? I mean, people will get that, right? I'm a dad, standing up for my daughter. We value youth sports, fairness, all that stuff. I'll get the media crew. You can talk to her. Right. So that story didn't get told, sort of reciting it anonymously. You see, in this version of the fable of The Emperor Has No Clothes, even the young boy in the crowd has quickly learned to keep his mouth shut. And should he begin to blurt out the truth, his parents would immediately clap their hands around his mouth, lest they all be publicly shamed and thrown into the emperor's dungeon. In my line of work, I see Christian schools facing the threats of crippling lawsuits, loss of accreditation, even loss of tax-exempt status, just for maintaining traditional Christian morality for their students and for their faculty. There's even new legislation in Massachusetts that would codify some of these new sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination policies in admissions, so directly impact all schools, including private schools. And before dropping out of the presidential race just a few weeks ago, Beto O'Rourke said that even churches that do not heal the LGBTQ line should lose their tax-exempt status. So this is when we tell ourselves, yes, it's bad, but as the Attorney General referenced, the pendulum will have to swing back at some point to a place of sanity. And a colleague of mine used to say, well, the pendulum will have to swing back or it'll swing right off the clock. Indeed, it may swing right off the clock, but I think it's equally likely that the pendulum will swing back, but that it won't matter. To extend this metaphor of the pendulum, we must step back and see that the grandfather clock in which the pendulum is swinging is actually sitting on a rail car, speeding the same direction that the pendulum is currently moving, so that even if it swings back, it will still not return to where it started. It's the idea of the shifting of the Overton window, that the range of ideas tolerated in public discourse is changing over time, so that previously unthinkable things become celebrated things, and what used to be common sense is now unspeakable. Now, defending against these external attacks takes up much of the focus and effort of the Mass Family Institute and the pro-family movement and the culture wars as a whole. Now, I think most people assume, as I did when you hear the term culture war, that the culture is what we're fighting over. It's the land or the battlefield on which these various forces contend. But I've come to the conclusion that the culture is not the battlefield, it is the weapon. In this revision of the culture wars metaphor, we find that our weapons, our culture, is thin and dull, that they betray us when we call on them in the heat of combat. And it is no longer surprising why we suffer so many staggering losses. The culture of Christendom has in so many places become weak and largely ineffective, particularly in this area of human sexuality. And so when I learned of the launch of a Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture, I thought, yes, that is precisely what we need to do. Now, the crisis we're facing in Christian culture, the need for it to be restored, is made clear to me in how our churches, schools, and families are not prepared for this campaign of organized destruction. In many instances, we are simply just a decade or so behind the surrounding culture, and we're assimilating. More concerning than the external attacks on the church and the family is what I see happening in our churches and families. The church militant often behaves as the church tolerant or the church acquiescent. Now, many pastors that I've talked to seem almost hardwired for cultural pacifism. I've been told multiple times that we want to be a church that if we disappeared tomorrow, our community would miss us. And I understand the sentiment there, but have you read the Beatitudes recently? That's not the goal. And I hear from so many faithful churchgoers, especially parents, who are utterly exhausted by having to fight the cultural battles to defend their families with little or no support from their church, often with dismissive condescension and sometimes even open hostility. I believe this is because so many churches are simply internalizing the moral norms of the surrounding culture, sometimes without even. For example, 2 years ago, few pastors would have gone to a homosexual wedding or a celebration of a civil ceremony. But now, I've heard from many who just don't know what to tell their flocks about, do you go to your cousin's gay wedding or not? Do you want to show love? I don't want to be offending. But what's changed? God's law hasn't. Just our comfort level with certain sins, which have become normalized. And that's true in a wide range of sexual sin. Another telling example, there's a Christianity Today edition from this fall, a variety of sort of new issues. And there was a quote next to their article on transgenderism that dealt with a man who now identifies as female and goes by the name Sarah. And this editor's note says, following general journalistic practice, we at Christianity Today follow a simple rule. Use the pronoun that the person uses. For example, we refer to Sarah, the person at the beginning of this essay, as a she, because Sarah identifies as one. It would have been unthinkable. They're acquiescing to it. They also, in the same edition, have a nuanced approach on how parents and pastors should address Christian young adults who have formed a polyamorous throuple. So it's a married man and woman who then incorporated, I think, a second woman into their relationship. Again, these things would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And I encounter this acquiescence and accommodation by the church in my work to mobilize the church, to contend for laws and cultural norms that preserve our freedom to live out our faith and pass it on successfully to our children. I see this as a loss of confidence or conviction in the traditional sexual morality of Christendom. We've also seen numerous Christian leaders turn away from a biblical understanding of human sexuality and eventually reject it, embracing instead the spirit of the age. Right here in New Hampshire, they ordained a bishop in the church of my youth, the Episcopal Church, a man who had left his wife and 2 children for another man. Large segments of the Lutheran Church, for example, have changed their teaching and practice on the issue of homosexuality as well, and the evangelical churches are not immune from this either. Tony Campola, Rob Bell, Jen Hatmaker, prominent figures in American evangelical now support the new LGBTQ orthodoxy. Even Josh Harris, author of the famous book on sexual purity, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which was popular in the 90s when I was dating, has recently kissed both his wife and Jesus goodbye and left the faith entirely. And he cites one of his reasons for doing so as being conflicted over the clear teaching of belief involved on human sexuality, and he now is marching in gay pride parades, apologizing to the LGBTQ community for things he has written and preached in the past. So we're confronted with story after story like this. So I remember when I heard a few years ago that a prominent Catholic bishop had remarked, in the context of external threats to the church, I expect sexual diamarter, as sobering as it is, what we should be truly fearful of is that the cardinal's successor will die a martyr, but that he will die apostate. And that's not intended to be a knock on the Catholic Church, but in all of Christendom. And a reminder of what the greater danger is. Now, in going through my notes, I wanted to confirm the quote, so I looked up who it was. Anybody know who made that quote? Cardinal George. Cardinal George in 2010. Does anyone know who? And then I learned that he had passed away. And I thought, well, I better look up to see who his successor is if I'm throwing this guy under the bus. Do you know who his successor is? Cardinal Kupich. I'll let you look him up later if you're not familiar with him. Yeah. I'm going with apostate, not martyr, but we'll see. We'll see. Lord's not done with him yet, hopefully. All right, well, as my wife tells me, I make a very nice prophet of doom, but what people want are solutions. So I'll take a stab at it. And of course, any part of the solution to our problem is political and legal defense of our ability to live out our faith and pass it on to the next generation. But having the right to do so does not ensure that we will. We need something more. And I have a couple ideas for a possible way forward, a component perhaps of the renewal of our Christian culture. For starters, I think we should begin to act like immigrants. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Well, let me share an anecdote with you from about 6 years ago. So when I was relatively new to MFI, we'd probably speak at maybe one church a quarter. And it was hard to get pastors to call their representatives or their state senators or to kind of talk on political stuff. So when I got a phone call from a pastor, it was on a Tuesday morning, and he said, hey, I'm going with some folks in the church to the State House. We're going to lobby against this new gender identity law. I said, really? Okay. When are you guys going? Well, we're going to be there at 11. This was 9 o'clock in the morning. And they said, can you come with us? We want your help. I said, absolutely. It was kind of like, when Jesus met the centurion on the road who said, look, I'm a man under authority. If you say my guy's healed, that's it. I'm good. I can just walk home. You don't have to come with me. Just, who is this pastor that gets it? Well, it was a Spanish-speaking pastor, Latino pastor from Quincy, a guy who works construction 6 days a week. He's planting a church on Sundays. They go to church school, and he saw the importance of advocating on this issue. And so I went to the State House. I helped show them kind of which offices they wanted to go visit, and the bills in this committee, the things in the Committee on the Judiciary, so you want to visit them. And then afterwards, they wanted to thank me, so they said, we've got to lay hands on Brother Beckwith. And so they all kind of gathered around me, and they prayed loudly. And I don't know if it was Spanish or in tongues or both. Very uncomfortable for me as sort of as an Episcopalian altar boy when I grew up. But really magnificent. The confidence, the boldness they had to march right up to the State House, speak truth into those halls of power, and then to pray. And that was the beginning of sort of a long and growing relationship with immigrant churches all over the Commonwealth that disproportionately are very much engaged on these issues and are not afraid to boldly advocate for truth. So there is something about these churches in the immigrant community that makes them very different in their willingness to publicly act on issues of human sexuality. They do not seem to suffer from the same paralysis or lack of confidence that more established churches often do. Now, many of the men and women in these churches, and particularly the leaders of the churches, were either not raised in the U.S. or did grow up here, but in a very different cultural context than their counterparts. And at least on issues of sexual morality, and certainly the transgender one, they're the better for it. Another example of strong cultural cohesion or confidence by immigrants. While many Christian parents are struggling with what to do about the soccer tournaments and lacrosse practices and other extracurricular activities that have now become ubiquitous on the once sacred Sunday morning, Muslim immigrants in Dearborn, Michigan have caused the high school football team to change its practice schedule to the middle of the night to accommodate the fast of Ramadan. This happened in part because the coaches knew the players were going to keep the fast and would not back down, even in the scorching hot August double sessions. The players and their families were united and unmovable in their observance of their faith. We need to be the same. Now, ironically, in the article about this team on ESPN, it even said that one of the non-Muslim players decided to start keeping the fast as well. That's the power of that cultural cohesion. Shame on so many of us for being manipulated by the culture so easily on this issue of Sunday activity and Sabbath rest. What would happen if we all told our coaches Sunday was a hard no? Do we have enough critical mass to make them back down? We won't find out unless we try. We can't remain isolated. We need to work together and have confidence and conviction in our faith and the traditional practices of our faith. Another thing is economic mutual support. And the more I thought about it, the more the model of the immigrant community provides many of the answers for the challenges we're beginning to face. For example, if that dad that I talked about earlier had to speak up publicly in protest of his daughter being bounced off the varsity squad by a transgender girl. So that's a boy or a girl. Let's say he lost his job. Other Christian business owners should help him find a new one. Christians must support each other economically. Isn't that what our immigrant forebears all did? If the Christian baker has his business threatened because he refuses to bake a same-sex wedding cake, he needs to know that every Christian in the If Christian lawyers, accountants, doctors, and others are denied licensure by the state or accreditation by their professional governing bodies because of their refusal to go along with the new sexual orthodoxy, which is a real risk, they will need clients and customers who will still patronize them. And believe me, we will need the therapists, doctors, and lawyers in particular who share our faith and have not embraced the lie on issues of human sexuality. We will need to make sure they can still earn a living. And these types of mutually reinforcing commercial networks remind me of a relative who married a Lebanese immigrant family who would occasionally sort of bemoan the fact that we've always got to go to the Lebanese doctor and the Lebanese baker and the Lebanese accountant. But that's part of how these immigrant communities survived and ultimately thrived. Immigrants in the U.S., whether 100 years ago or now, tend to have their own culture, often with a strong and distinct sense of identity and community. We need that again for ourselves. Now, if we're to restore a culture of vibrant, deeply held Christian faith and conviction, we have to be willing to choose God over worldly success. If you get fired from your job because of your Christian convictions, the Christian community should support you in finding employment. But we have to acknowledge that it's very likely, on average, that it may not be the same level of compensation. If you get fired from a big bank in Boston and you're working for a small organization run by someone else in your parish, you may not make as much money. And once again, this would be similar to immigrant families who, on average, have a lower level of income than native populations, but they make it work. And that means we need to at least be prepared to have a standard of living we're accustomed to now. Now, I know that runs contrary to the whole idea of the but the time is coming when many of us will have to choose our faith over our careers. Now, here's where I go, and they would call this in a Baptist church, I'm going to go from preaching to meddling. I think this idea of choosing our faith over our careers and economic success, it's true not just in a reactive sense. In other words, if we get threatened, we have to do the right thing, we may lose our job. We have to be intentional about it and proactive. For example, getting into an Ivy League college may clearly be what's in the best interest of our children's professional and financial prospects, but is it what's best for their soul? I've heard from many faithful parents who send their kids to the best schools only to have them graduate with a degree and no faith. This is going to be a hard sell. If New England, arguably the academic capital of the modern world, is the new Athens, then Athena is very much our goddess. Even in my own upbringing, I saw this when I was a junior in college. I'd met my future wife, and I wanted to ask her to marry me, so I kind of sat down with my folks, and I said, Mom and Dad, I think we're going to ask Karen to marry me. And they said, well, we love Karen. We think that'd be great, but don't you want to get your master's degree first? You should probably get your master's degree first. And I said, praise God, I don't really know what I want to get from my master's. Like, I'm going to get it. I'm just not sure what I want to do for my master's yet. But I'm pretty sure I want to marry Karen, so I'm going to do that. And I did. And because I was married to her is why I ended up going to law school, so it worked out. But it turns out I was bucking not only my parents' advice in doing that, but marriage trends in general. The age of first marriage is now in the mid to late 20s. In Massachusetts, it's 29.5 for women and 31 for men. It's the highest in the country other than Vermont. I think it's 32 for guys. Now, by the time I was 31, I'd been married for nearly a decade and already had 3 children. Fertility. It's another area where we need to be more like immigrant families, who also tend to be larger with more children. Now, right now in Massachusetts, the total fertility rate, which essentially is the average number of children per woman per lifetime, is 1.5, the lowest in the nation and well below replacement, which is 2.1. New Hampshire is 1.52, so almost the same, a little bit higher. That includes so many of the outliers like us who come from or have started families of 4, 5, 6. But as a whole, we have become a society that simply cannot be bothered to sustain itself. This has been termed demographic winter. In this sense, the cult of sexual parasite on our society, a body, and slowly killing it in the process. It really is a culture of death. Sodomy and abortion are simply not a strategy for civilizational growth. Now, Ross Douthat, in a 2012 column in the New York Times, lays out the dire economic and social consequences of population decline and closes with this. The retreat from child rearing is, at some level, a symptom of late modern exhaustion, a decadence that first arose in the West but now haunts rich societies around the globe. It's a spirit that privileges the present over the future, chooses stagnation over innovation, prefers what already exists over what might be. It embraces the comforts and pleasures of modernity while shrugging off the basic sacrifices that built our civilization in the first place. And I would agree. And I think that people are, ironically, having fewer children in part because of a higher standard of living. I believe our declining fertility is direct. For example, in 1960, a typical family in America had one car, a 1,500 square foot house, and 3 or more children. Today, on average, we have 2 or more cars, a 2,600 square foot home, and 2 children or less. 3/4 of Americans surveyed said they didn't have more kids because of the costs associated with raising them and the challenges of the economy. Children used to be seen as a source of wealth and joy. Now they are viewed as a massive financial liability and a drag on the personal fulfillment of would-be parents. A couple of years ago, I was on a business trip in Arizona. And I got up early to catch the sunrise on Camelback Mountain. And while I was kind of walking up there, I was worrying about whether or not I was going to be able to pay for college for my 3 kids at the time, or to help them out the way my parents helped me out. And I was worried about, would their standard of living be improving? And my wife and I talked about whether or not we should have a 4th child, but we worried about the costs associated with it. Were we doing the right thing by having her homeschool the kids instead of working? And would we be bad parents if we did not or could not pay for all of our kids' college? And I felt like God spoke to me. Again, it wasn't audible, just sort of like a flash thought that what I should be concerned about isn't a higher economic standard of living, but a higher standard of living from generation to generation. That's the goal. That's what's truly important. Now, as our own history from many of our families shows, that as powerful as the example of immigrant communities is, the cultural solidarity is likely not sustainable, at least not under the traditional model where the children of immigrants typically assimilate. That's been the strength of America for 2 centuries. But when I speak to immigrant churches now, I encourage them not to assimilate. The American culture has largely lost its family values, and we need theirs that they bring from their home countries. In order to really find a long-term solution, we can't just mimic some of the characteristics of immigrant communities. We need not to just prevent assimilation of those who are new here, but we need to learn how to actively de-assimilate ourselves. And just like the immigrant families hammered into their children to become good Americans and even stop using their native tongues at home, we need to instill in our children the culture of the kingdom. That's where our citizenship lies. But when I look around at our Christian community, much of it seems like a flotilla of boats all being carried downstream by the cultural current towards the rocks and the falls, ultimately. And even those who are dutifully trying to row against the current are only slowing down the inevitable. What's necessary is to row straight to shore, get out of the boat, and then march on land back upstream to safety, a return to what we had before. This is going to require a conscious change in attitude in a number of things, as I've mentioned. But again, we have to realize that the institutions of civil society in America, which were designed to assist us in raising and educating our children, have almost uniformly been compromised and are failing us. We must be perpetually vigilant of the seepage into our homes and families from a surrounding culture that is increasingly toxic, if not demonic. Therefore, in order to have large families to be fruitful and multiply, and to educate them, whether through private Christian schools or homeschooling if we can, will require accepting a lower standard of living in many cases. We must wake our people up from the American dream, which asserts that success is defined by one's children having a higher standard of living than their parents. We must reorient ourselves towards prioritizing our children's standard of eternal living at the expense of everything else. Finally, immigrant communities are able to both bind themselves together and insulate themselves from hostile cultural, in part through their shared language. Now, I'm not saying we should all learn Spanish or Italian or Russian or even Greek or Latin, although the last two you can make a good argument for. But we can unite around the shared language of our own music, our own art, our own literature. This is how we ensure that our weapons in the culture war are sharp and strong. And I'm not talking about creating more cringe-worthy Christian movies with Stephen Baldwin. To start, at least, let's return to what we know works. The hymns, religious art, and iconography, books that served our ancestors well. Anthony Eslin writes about this in his book, Up from the Ashes. Use what has stood the test of time. Occasionally, I'm a high church Anglican from my youth. I'll often debate with people about the value of praise music and praise courses in churches. Bemoan the questionable theology and the musical campiness of the latest praise songs. But typically I can end the debate by just saying, well, look, who's going to be singing that song in 300 years? And they have no answer to that. So we need to all learn the same hymns again. For us, our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, all worshiping God with one voice. There is tremendous cultural strength in that. And one of the greatest visions of hope I've had in the past couple of years, I was at a homeschool debate tournament. It's like a 3-day tournament. It was Saturday night, so everyone had finished all the competitions for the judges to tell the closing ceremonies. These high school kids have been working hard, for 3 days straight. They're all in the gym at the school where we're hosting the tournament. Again, on Saturday night, probably 6, 7 o'clock at night. They're not on their devices, not goofing around. They were singing hymns. There was a sort of a core of about half a dozen kids, high schoolers, that were good vocalists, doing some good harmonizations, and they were singing all these classic hymns that everyone knew, or knew enough to sing along. And they just kind of sucked everybody else in towards them with the sound of their voices. So you had concentric circles of the sort of the core singers, and then other students, and the parents kind of just wandered into the gym there, and all singing. Lasted about a half an hour. And most of the parents were in tears, just with joy, that if this is what your high school kids are doing on their own on a Saturday night, we're doing something right. So let's make sure that what is in our children's minds, their lips, and in their hearts are hymns of praise that we can all sing together. Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be here, but that idea of we all know the same songs, we all speak the same worship language. So in summation, if we can embrace having confidence, pride, joy in our Christian identity, and there's a lot of talk about identity nowadays, right? But as Christians, our identity, it's not our libido, it's in Christ. And we need to have at least as much ferocity in that as other forces have in these different mutually, so that we can withstand professional ostracization for standing up for the faith. If we can subordinate our dreams of worldly success and prioritize marriage, children, and church involvement, if we can bind our communities together with our tremendous legacy of Christian music, art, and literature, then I think we'll be well on our way to restoring Christian culture and doing what Cardinal George prophesied would eventually happen. When he was speaking sort of after the proverbial martyred cardinal, he said that his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization as the church has done so often in human history.
Thank you very much. Andrew has indicated he'd be happy to take some questions. We have a few minutes with him, and if no one else has one ready, I was speaking with students today in class and over dinner about the U.S. Constitution and how it is silent on moral issues. Is this part of the problem? Is it, well, do you understand where I'm going?
I do. Well, yeah, and I think the best way to address that question would be to quote, I think it was John Adams, who said, "The Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other." And I think what he means is that the vision of the Founding Fathers is that sort of a minimalist government on all these things because we want men to regulate themselves. In reading William Blackstone, who was a English jurist who wrote a 4-volume treatise on the law, Commentaries on the Laws of England, which I read somewhere, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but Abraham Lincoln didn't actually go to law school to become an attorney. He read through Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England twice and then apprenticed, which would frankly be a better legal education in some instances than what we get a lot nowadays. But in those commentaries, which were very influential for the Founding Fathers, he talks about the pursuit of happiness, right? And we all see, we see that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I always thought that, okay, so life and liberty, I get it, those are big existential things. The pursuit of happiness just kind of feels a little light compared to that. Well, when Blackstone talks about the pursuit of happiness, the way he defines it, and I think this is the way the Founding Fathers saw it as well, was the ability to pursue God's will for one's life. That's a very different idea of happiness than the way the word is used nowadays. So, yeah, again, to follow what Adam said, if we lose our internal moral compass, the Constitution is not going to work. It wasn't designed to work without that shared moral consensus. Sir?
So given your thesis of isolation, you must have encountered the question of what the result will be for Christians to make themselves the other, to isolate themselves from society and become the other, because societies visit prejudice and accentuates prejudice when a component of the society is the other. And wouldn't the better solution be to evangelize, be out there in front, constantly talking about not to isolate ourselves, but to accept the fact that we've got to push back, but to speak of who we are.
So it wasn't my intent to emphasize an isolation, a set-apartedness, yes, but I don't think that's mutually exclusive with evangelization. For example, the Muslim players in the football team were apparently very clear on what their faith was and what the implications of their faith were for practical living, but that didn't cause them to be isolated. They were still playing on the high school football team in Dearborn, Michigan, and as I mentioned, other players who weren't Muslim actually began to follow the same practices. And that's
They were evangelizing in their own way.
Right.
Confrontation, that's the way they assert their faith.
But I think we can act similarly if we have sort of, if we rebuild these practices of faith, we'll be living still, this we live in now, reinforcing each other. One of the greatest challenges I think we have now of faith is that we're often so isolated. And we just don't have those thick ties of a community of shared faith that maybe we used to, or that some immigrant communities seem to have. And I know some people will be concerned about well, is this kind of like fundamentalism and, you know, we're just cutting ourselves off from society? That would not be the goal either. We have to balance. How are we set apart? You know, there are some things we're not going to do. There's some places we won't go. There are words we will not say. We're going to call men men and women women, for example, which is an actual challenge nowadays. You have public school teachers I've talked to that they may lose their job if they don't call the 8th grade girl who identifies as a boy by, you know, he. There's a teacher in Virginia that actually did lose his job. So I think we can draw clear lines for what our behavioral expectations will be, but that doesn't necessarily cut us off from the surrounding culture. It just means that we're not going to absorb the practices and the beliefs of the surrounding culture, but it's going to be a tough balance. Sir?
How fruitful do you think kind of the immigrant efforts of cohesion will be among Christians, or could be among Christians, while there still remain kind of serious differences in belief among various Christians?
I don't know who coined the term the ecumenicism of the trenches, but I've seen that a lot in my work. And it may be not one monolithic sort of Christian network. Probably, frankly, it'd be a lot of smaller Christian networks that may work together on certain levels. I think it can't be sort of organized from the top down. It has to be very organic. You know, it starts really with the family. We need strong dads to say, look, this is what I will not permit to happen to my family or for my family to participate in, and we're going to prioritize, you know, church on Sundays, and whether it's, you know, Saturday night Vespers or Wednesday night service or different things like that. And then that'll branch out to other families working together. And if you get enough families in one community that say, we're not doing soccer Sunday mornings, but one simple example, you may have coaches decide they got to find a different time to practice. Little things like that have an incremental effect over time. So, yeah, definitely theological differences, but I think the vast majority of small o Orthodox Christians, at least on these issues where the culture is constantly rubbing up against us, have a unity of understanding, right, on the issues of human sexuality. I mean, that's how I'm able to do my job with Catholics and Protestants and all different types of Protestants, because we focus on those issues that we have a shared vision on, and yet are also the issues that are probably of the biggest challenge right now to people of faith. John?
Yeah, Andrew, just wanted to thank you for being here, and as knowing what you guys do in Massachusetts, we can't thank you enough for the gathering that you have each year. This is a prelude to the question, but I wanted to thank you because I tell you that event that we attend is one of the greatest immigrant gatherings of. It just feels like we're home. And when we are in the culture and we see what happens at the fine gatherings,
Yeah.
It really does feel like we are together. And I want to thank you for hosting and sponsoring that.
Yeah, well, it's a joy to do it. It's kind of like putting on a wedding every year, so a lot of work goes into it. But at first I was kind of like, why are we doing this banquet? Because it takes up so much time. But I've seen its tremendous value in it, in part because it is a great way. It builds some cultural resiliency and some strength. So for those of you who don't know, it's an annual fundraiser. We usually have 400 to 500 people at this big banquet hall at a nice hotel. Very fancy, very positive. And I remember the first time that I went, before I was even on the board, and it was just so encouraging to know that we're surrounded by 400 to 500 people who share the same family values. And that's the type of thing we need to have more of. Because again, people are typically feel isolated and intimidated on these issues, right? Whether it's the Boston Globe or your Twitter feed, you're going to get hammered if you step out of line on these things. You can get hammered if you go to Chick-fil-A for a sandwich and post it on Twitter. It's crazy out there. But if you know you're not alone, there's tremendous strength in that. And that's what I think that the immigrant community seems to have a better handle on sometimes. When I was in the Marine Corps, that we had 2-man fighting holes. They weren't foxholes, they were fighting holes. We had 2 men in them. So you weren't isolated. You were always tied into the next, fighting hole over. And that's how you have a defensive line. You work together.
So as the, thank you for that. And as the husband of an immigrant mother of 10, we often wrestle with the right way of what do we think is best strategy, because we subscribe very deeply to this notion of, yes, we live in the world and there's got to be a way to fight it, and sometimes that means going out into the world, to not hiding your light, basket, and we love that dearly. However, we understand that it comes with risks, and I just wanted to echo your point around one of the biggest challenges we think, and maybe this is the connected, having that opportunity to have a foundation, I think is really important, and I think that comes with this immigrant notion that you spoke of this evening. So thank you again for that.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, look, my eldest is 16, so the jury's still out on whether or not I'm getting it right. But what I've chosen to do, my wife and I, is, we'll just say to our boys sometimes, hey, look, we're Christians. You're just going to be different. Get used to it. And try to instill that in them so that they know that sometimes they're going to live very differently than their friend, than the other kids in the soccer team or the robotics club or whatever. And also, this need, so again, to the isolation question, that's an important point. What I'm talking about is having culturally kind of a home base, like your castle that is a safe place to be rejuvenated, to have some peace, so you can ride back out into the fray. I mean, in my line of work, I really appreciate church. I really look forward to going on Sundays and worshiping and just kind of coming back to sanity because of how crazy it is out there. And I think we need our safe space too sometimes, right? Sir. Do you have a question? Yeah. Sir.
Yes, on the subject of contraception.
Okay.
It is extremely rare, except for Nellie Gray years ago, that the topic is ever raised with most pro-life groups.
Yeah.
And it's also well known, according to Pharmacists for Life, there's about 5 to 1 abortifacient abortions for every 1 surgical abortion. Add to that, Human Life International, they claim 60% of surgical abortions are directly rooted in failed contraception.
Right.
So if my math is right, well over 90% of your abortions are rooted in contraception.
Mm-hmm.
Now it seems the floodgates opened up in the Lambeth Conference, the Anglican Lambeth Conference?
Yes, 1930. Yeah.
What are your ideas in closing the floodgates, if any?
So as a Protestant who works with Catholics and Protestants, this is a third rail I have not stepped on yet. So I mean, look, this is one of the areas that I think there's not agreement on amongst the various branches of the Christian faith. But I can say, just looking at the demographics, so you've got the abortion issue, yes. But going back to the demography, we're at 1.5 in Massachusetts. China's at 1.66, and they just, until recently, had a one-child policy. So I will say this, if when I was a younger man in college or high school, I'd had a vision, or been given a vision, of family that was intentional and fruitful. And I had a great upbringing. I'm not saying anything about that, my parents, but just the idea of having more than 3 kids was kind of like, wow, that's crazy. Now we have 4, and if I could do it again, I think we might have more. And that can be a cultural thing too. If large families is the expectation, and we view children differently. to some extent the contraception question would resolve itself, at least for people of faith. That's not a very good answer. But again, I think we have to change, for some of us, how we view children and what the purpose of marriage is, and reevaluate that. And then the good news is, I don't know how exactly the math works out, but if the people of faith continue to have bigger families, whether it's 3 or 4 or 10, and the folks who don't share our family values can continue to go the way of the world, which is, less than 1.5, right? Because that 1.5 in Massachusetts is propped up by crazies like Sean and me and everybody else, right? So you take that real disparity and you run it down a couple generations, the whole society will be transformed if we can pass our faith on successfully to our children. But again, after that sort of experience on Camelback Mountain in Arizona, my life goal is 12 Christian grandchildren. And if I have 12 Christian grandchildren, that means a lot of important things will fall into place. That means that my children will likely have gotten married other people who share the same faith, and will have successfully transmitted that faith to their children. So hopefully we can, if we get a sense of that type of, that being the priority, right? That's where sort of our earthly treasures are. Yes, ma'am, maybe the last one?
How would you counter the argument that many people face when trying to evangelize or share your views, that they reply, you can't force your morals on me.
Yes.
And the common response is, you do you, and then you just walk away.
Yeah,
How would you
no, that's great. I mean, what I get a lot of times, and even from pastors, not the immigrant pastors, is you can't legislate morality. Similar argument. And look, I can tell you very plainly from working at the State House, we absolutely legislate morality. The only question is whose morality is getting legislated. So there's this myth of sort of religious or moral neutrality, right? That the public square is just sort of neutral. And we don't want to impose any morality onto it because that would affect everybody else. It's not true. It's not true. We're constantly having a secular, progressive, hypersexualized morality imposed on us. I was just talking a few minutes before we started about, kindergartners who are having the morality of transgenderism and that ideology imposed on them and their parents. And I had a phone call this morning from a mother whose 8th grade son is concerned because 2 of his female classmates now identify as male and they're using the boys' restroom. And so there's some privacy concerns there. So that is not the result of a morally neutral education space. So it's not a very succinct answer, but I mean the reality is people's morality, we're having other people's morality imposed on us all the time. All right.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Andrew was very gracious to come here this evening, although he has to catch a plane early in the morning to go to Washington because there are problems there as well, which he has to fix. I promised him that we wouldn't keep him late. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks.